I appreciate everybody joining us for our pro tips on writing real estate offers and avoiding common pitfalls of negotiating with confidence. So anyways, I'm JoAnne Hamberg-Magurn with the Real Estate Exchange, and we are located in Lunenburg. I've owned the Real Estate Exchange since 1990, and I'm really lucky today to have Attorney Len Foy joining me to go over a few things. And I'd like to introduce you guys to Len Foy. And if you would mind, Len, sharing a little information about you and your company.
Certainly. I'll try to keep my biography brief. My name is Len Foy, and I'm a real estate attorney with our corporate headquarters are in Nashua, New Hampshire. We also have an office in Salem, New Hampshire. Our office conducts real estate transactions throughout New England, but primarily, of course, in New Hampshire and Massachusetts. I think Massachusetts is going to be our focus tonight. I've been licensed in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts since 1998. And thank you for JoAnne for including me as a panelist.
Oh, this is exciting. I like doing these, and it's nice to be able to share some of the information you and I have learned throughout the years. So anyways, if anyone does have any questions, there is a chat box. You're welcome to enter any questions you might have, and Attorney Foy and I will answer them at the end of the webinar. We do have a few topics that we're going to talk about, and I just want to start right in. And and when you're writing an offer, what is required to be considered a valid enforceable agreement?
Would you like me to take a swing at that one?
Yes, please. What would you consider? There's many things that we've talked about over the years, but when writing an offer, there are certain things that are required to make it a valid enforceable agreement. And I just would love for you to share that with us.
Absolutely. So I would say focus on several very important issues. First and foremost, I think all of us in real estate know that offers and contracts and agreements to convey real estate must be in writing and signed ideally by both parties, but certainly signed by the party against whom the contract is going to be enforced. For all the obvious reasons, we do not permit verbal real estate agreements because there's just too much opportunity for fraud and mistake. So an offer must be in writing, and it must be signed by both the buyer and the seller. So that's number one. And I think possibly a less obvious requirement of an offer is that it be capable of enforcement so that it not be fatally vague or uncertain in any key respects. Just a couple of examples. An offer that does not we have to take an offer and we have to say, if we march off to court to enforce this offer and we hand it to a judge, will they be able to interpret our offer and enforce it against the parties? That would be difficult if that offer did not set forth a price, or if that offer did not set forth a closing date. So if there are key material terms that are missing from that offer, the problem with that offer is that it's probably not legally enforceable because it's not capable of being interpreted by a judge were there to be a dispute over its enforcement. So those things come to mind. Every now and then I'll see an offer across my desk. This usually happens in the earlier part of the year. It's 2023. People are still working on 2022. Now, it's obvious what's occurred, but watch out for that just the same. A clever and dishonest party, namely the seller, I think in that case, could claim that because the closing date is a date which is passed, the offer is unenforceable. And of course, that would be in the hands of a judge. I wouldn't want to be in that situation trying to enforce an offer that had an expired closing date.
Oh, absolutely. I know through the years, we've always been, it needs to be in writing, has to be dated, signed by all parties to the contract. The terms need to be written out, the price, the date, what they're actually negotiating. And, one of the items that's always been important is consideration. And, people will be like, oh, well, what's consideration? So what do you consider consideration when writing an agreement? I always look at it as we're writing an offer, consideration is the amount of money they're putting down, what they're offering to pay. The fact that they're putting a deposit down binds the agreement. How is it how do you look at it?
So much of real estate conveyancing finds its underpinnings in contract law. So we've taken the law of contracts and we've expanded it into real estate. So there is a notion in the rules of contract formation that a contract must be supported by consideration. So the seller is agreeing to sell the home, and they're further agreeing not to sell the home to any other party. The buyer needs to make sure that their offer is accompanied by some consideration. That would traditionally be the deposit that accompanies the offer. And then, of course, once we go to a purchase and sales agreement, there is traditionally a second deposit, although that's not required. I still see transactions cross my desk with a single offer. Where this comes into play, not relevant necessarily for real estate agents possibly, but if you have a family transaction, and so mom and dad are going to sell a property to a child or to a family member, and they decide to just, well, we don't need to do a deposit because we're all family. That's true. And I'm not going to be the guy that says, no, we're going to have a deposit here. Just understand, though, from the buyer's perspective, that contract probably is not enforceable. So if the seller's had a change of heart, and of course, would make for an ugly Thanksgiving, but if the buyers decided to march off to court and enforce the contract against mom and dad, it would be hurtful to their position if they didn't have a deposit. There would be a valid argument to be made that the contract was not supported by consideration on the buyer's side. So
absolutely.
And one other thing too, I wouldn't play with fire on this, but it's an old legal adage that we never question. We question the existence of consideration. We do not question the sufficiency of consideration. Can you tie up a $10 million property with a $500 deposit? Yes, you can. You absolutely can. It may seem absurd and ridiculous, but the judge of the court will not examine the sufficiency of the consideration and say, oh, it's too small, or it's not enough, or it's way out of proportion with the price of the property. Doesn't work that way. I think I wouldn't do $1 because I think you're tempting fate, but a $500 deposit, although I don't see those as frequently, is certainly more than enough.
Yeah, I think that sometimes with, a lot of buyers that are getting financing via VA or USDA, and, they're looking at, oh, well, I don't need any money down. They don't realize that you still need to put some kind of money with the contract to bind the agreement, because, if the seller gets a better offer, they could up and go for a different offer and cancel that agreement. And I think it's important for people to realize they do need to put something down or some type of consideration so that it makes the contract valid. Today, since COVID, it's been a couple years now. We've had COVID, and a lot of things have changed in the market. Again, I've been doing this almost 40 years, and, people are waiving home inspections, and I really hate to see this happen. So I always stress that, please have a home inspection, but a lot of folks are to the point that they're like, well, I'm not going to get the house if I don't do a home inspection. And, what are your thoughts about home inspections and waiving your rights to it? Or, if I waive my rights to a home inspection, should I still have a home inspection? And where does a buyer actually stand if they waive their rights to a home inspection, or do a home inspection for informational purposes only?
I mean, it's such a rich and diverse area. We probably could do an hour on this subject alone, and it's so relevant because it's just so fashionable right now to waive inspections, or to do inspections for informational purposes only, or to say that the inspection will be for informational purposes only unless there's more than $20,000 worth of remediation that needs to be done. And it's almost on every contract. So I'm just going to hit a couple of the high points because I don't want to use up all of our time on this, although this is a fascinating subject. Number one, my phone rings constantly with people, embittered people, who have purchased homes, who waived inspections, who closed, and who have made grisly discoveries about their property, and they now want to sue everybody in sight. It's sometimes the agent, because of course the agent's always the one that coached them on not doing the inspection. It's finger pointing gone, run amok.
He said, she said.
No doubt about it. But my advice to these people is usually something like this. if you waived inspections, then, and you probably signed signed on to some language in the purchase and sales agreement, making clear that you have waived inspections and you've relinquished all of your rights in that department, you probably don't have legal recourse in terms of chasing a seller through the legal system after the closing for property defects and ailments and undisclosed conditions or whatever discoveries have been made after the closing. You probably just have to own that as the buyer by having waived inspections.
Adjourn the transaction too. If the seller allows them to do it for informational purposes only, they need to realize that if something comes up, they're going to lose their deposit if they want to back out.
There's no question about it. And for agents, a cautionary tale, which JoAnne and I talked about before. I'm familiar with at least one transaction where the buyers were able to secure the property by waiving inspections. The agent or somebody acting on behalf of the agent was able to get access to the property ostensibly for the purposes of conducting measurements, planning, for furniture shopping, whatever the ruse was to get access to the property, and proceeded to conduct inspections, unauthorized inspections. And then, of course, the results of those inspections were utilized to further negotiate or renegotiate the sales price. So I think if you are a listing, and I've seen this before, and it's tough, but I think if you're the listing agent and you have a buyer that's waived inspections, and then after the purchase and sales agreement has been signed, I don't think you can deny them access to the property. That's usually allowed for under the contract, but I think that needs to be supervised access, and not just letting a buyer and a buyer's agent wander around the property and potentially conduct inspections. And so I think you have to kind of draw a hard line there if you're the listing agent and say, yes, you signed the purchase and sales agreement, and yes, you waived inspections, but we're still not going to allow you to conduct an inspection, but you can conduct an inspection once we've closed and you're the owner of record. And that's a hard conversation nobody wants to have, but it creates too much opportunity for mischief if you don't draw that line. That's from the listing agent's perspective.
No, and I think that people just need to be aware that if you waive a home inspection or you do it for informational purposes only, you're buying that property the way it is. And you really should be cautious. Some agents in the field have been doing pre-inspections. So before they even write an offer, if there's time allowed, agents will make arrangements to get in prior for a quick home inspection, just so that the buyers have a better idea of the condition of the property so they can make their best offer possible. And I said a lot of homes are selling really quick. One of the new...
Oh.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
No, it's still really busy. One of my agents just put, I think, 7 under agreement this week. It's been pretty busy, but one of the other things which was new to me was gap money. That was brought up basically from what I'm understanding on gap money is if you put in an offer on the property and say it's 300,000 and they're asking 300,000 and you offer 325, you can offer to pay the 25,000 in cash over the asking price and agree that if the property doesn't appraise for the 325, that you would cover up to 25,000 of that. I bet you've seen some of that.
I definitely am. And I just wanted to make a note too, JoAnne, after we talk about the gap and the appraisal gap, we do have a question from one of our attendees. Maybe we can address that question after we talk about the appraisal gap. So the appraisal gap language continues to confound and frustrate, I think, even the most seasoned of real estate professionals, because I really feel like we agree on the language, but then selling agent or buyer's agent and listing agent sort of emerge from that with differing views of what it really means. So a true appraisal gap is where a buyer says that I'm going to pay X number of dollars over an appraisal which fails to equal or exceed the purchase price. So using the $100,000 home that doesn't exist, buyer says I'm going to pay an appraisal gap of $10,000. The property appraises for $90,000. The buyer has to supply the additional 10 and close at $100,000. Now, I've seen situations where buyer agrees to pay an appraisal gap. And let's just stay with the $100,000 home, but they're only going to pay a $5,000 appraisal gap. Property appraises for $90,000. Okay, buyer and agent kind of go into conference and say, well, I guess we're going to close at 95. Listing agent throws up the stop sign. Wait a second. We're not obligated to sell this property for less than the purchase price. Sometimes the listing agent will put that in there, and I would recommend it. I think it's understood and it's axiomatic that the seller cannot be forced to sell a property for less than the purchase price, whether the appraisal gap has been met or not. But I still think that it's good to add that language again from the listing agent perspective. Buyer agrees to pay appraisal gap of up to X. Under no circumstances shall seller be obligated to sell the property for less than the purchase price, absent negotiations between the parties or something to that effect. I don't think you have to have it in there, because then, of course, when I have this conversation with agents and we're trying to sort it out, the agent will say, well, wait a second, my guy only has to pay $5,000 over, so they got to close. And I said, well, what if it appraised for $25,000, staying with this fictitious home here? Do you think you could go to the seller and say, well, you got to sell it to me for $25,000 appraisal plus my $5,000 appraisal gap? That's an absurd result. So that's where these battles are waged. I have seen transactions, high-end stuff, but I'm still seeing it, where the buyer is agreeing to pay an unlimited appraisal gap and not rely on a denial of financing as an excuse to try to get their money back. I have a contract on my desk just like that right now. And the seller's attorney has included a lot of language to the effect that the deposit goes automatically to the seller. We're not going to go to court. You can't refuse to release the money. So that's an unconditional, unlimited appraisal gap. So in that case, that's a situation where the buyer knows that they have more than sufficient cash on hand to make up that gap. But I still see people getting tripped up on these appraisal gaps.
Yeah,
So,
I actually have a transaction like that right now, where it doesn't matter if it appraises or not, they're going to pay for it. And, no home inspection. They did a pre-home inspection. And so, yeah, we actually have one like that. But I mean, years ago, we would put in, property to appraise at or above purchase price. And if it didn't, we'd renegotiate. Today, with multiple offers and home selling quickly, that's pretty much gone. But things do change all the time with the market. So who knows? There's always something new I learn in this real estate market all the time. But like you mentioned, we did have one question that came in.
actually, two questions. We've got two,
Okay.
so we should probably try to address them both in order if we can.
Well,
The first
yeah,
one is all you. The first one's all you, JoAnne. That's
I
yours.
hate escalation clauses. I'm like the worst one for escalation clauses, but an escalation clause is basically when, the question is, when is it, I can't see the whole thing.
I can help.
What is an escalation clause and how do I know when to use one? Well, whenever you think there's going to be a multiple offer situation, you can put in an escalation clause. The escalation clause is basically set up as you're going to offer X amount, but you'd be willing to go this high. And most of the time people will put in, I'll go 1,000 or 2,000 over the highest price up to 200,000 or whatever price range they're in. I think they are handy, but sometimes when you end up with a property and you have 20, 30 offers, it can get really confusing. At least for me as a listing agent, I end up with sheets and who's going to go how high and how much. So a lot of times when I end up with a transaction with multiple escalation clauses and different offers with multiple escalation clauses, I'll go back to everybody with highest and best and to please remove the escalation clauses because it does make it much cleaner. But they are a good negotiation tool. I mean, what do you feel, Len?
I agree. And again, that's more your side of the street. Usually by the time I get my hands on the offer, that battle is over and the smoke is cleared. The one thing that I think is interesting, I periodically have seen some I've seen some sort of sparring over the requirement that the successful bidder be provided with a redacted copy of the contract which they escalated over. And isn't that a part of this process? So if you agreed to pay an escalation of $2,000 over the next highest offer, let's say, and so that bumped you up from, say, 150 to 177, are you then entitled to see that other offer as proof, so you know that you're not getting handled? Or,
Yes,
yeah,
yes, you'll usually disclose the other offer.
yeah.
Yeah.
And then this other question is wonderful. Okay, and we have some follow-up here from Jackie saying, I write it in.
Yeah,
And
I think it's something about the inspection that but if they're gonna have if they're either gonna have back to home inspections, like I said, it's easier to kind of answer these at the end, but if you just do a regular home inspection, then of course you can renegotiate or get out. But if you're doing a home inspection for informational purposes only, unless you put some kind of language in there that says, for repairs that exceed $10,000, you don't have an opportunity to get out. That's my understanding. Because you're basically getting the information, what needs to be fixed on the home, and you take care of it yourself. Isn't that correct, Len, or am I?
No, I would agree with it. And I think the only thing I would throw in, and again, I guess one of the benefits that I have is that even though we don't take on a lot of legal disputes, this phone to my left here rings all day long with tales of woe. And every now and then I see people really getting tripped up. And one transaction comes to mind where the buyer waived inspections, but carved out a right to do inspections for informational purposes only. This is relevant to the question. This is a New Hampshire transaction, but this could happen anywhere. Their initial deposit, New Hampshire also has a two-tier deposit structure where you put down a smaller deposit and then a more substantial one. But this was a very desirable home in the Lakes region, and this buyer decided to put down a whopping, I don't know, it might have been a $25,000 deposit accompanying what was at that time an offer. And then made some discoveries about the property during the inspection phase, but had agreed that it was for informational purposes only. But some of the discoveries they made were pretty troubling, including mold and just some things that raised serious red flags. Wouldn't you know it, they had to go to court to fight over that deposit because the seller took the position that, hey, this inspection was for informational purposes only, and that deposit is at risk. What's the moral of that story? Be careful with that initial deposit. Don't get too cute. We all like to dazzle sellers with big deposits, and it certainly does communicate seriousness, and it's a commitment. But that first deposit should still be an amount of money that you could live without in case you run into an unreasonable seller or a psychotic seller, and you have some kind of a confusion over the inspection and the ground rules of the inspection. Because I would caution people against making that first deposit too significant before you get to the purchase and sales agreement. Something goes awry. The bigger that deposit is, the more tempting it'll be for a seller to dig in and fight for it. And factor in the inconvenience, the property being off the market for a while, and their legal expenditures. So don't get too creative with that initial deposit, I would say, especially if there's any uncertainty about the inspection.
Yeah, but you don't want to be too skimpy either. You don't want to be too skimpy either, because they want to see serious, and it's important to have two decent deposits. When you do make an offer, a lot of times you'll make an offer and the seller will counter offer, and when you get the counter offer, is there like a time frame that the seller has to agree to allow you? Or what if another offer comes in and I, as the buyer, haven't said, yeah, I'll go with that counter offer? Is it not true that the seller can just go on to the other offer? They don't have to wait for you to accept their counter offer?
So let me see if I can just kind of map this out. So we have an offer that a seller has chosen not to accept outright, but what the seller has done is they've countered.
Yes.
So, well, first of all, most offers that I encounter have a set duration. So the buyer will say that this offer is only going to be good for 24 hours or 48 hours, whatever it might be. So
Mhm.
that's of a finite duration. Seller basically declines to accept the offer, but counters. I don't know that these counter offers are necessarily date sensitive or time sensitive, although they ought to be, and maybe they are. But certainly before the buyer formally accepts, remember that would have to be in writing because we talked about that. Before
Yeah.
the buyer formally accepts that counter, which then becomes a contract, the seller can certainly withdraw or rescind that counter. So that can be done. And I'm not sure if that's responsive to your question or not, but you
No,
and I,
I'm
yeah,
sorry, I'm gonna cut you off. Absolutely. I mean, I think one of the things that we want to understand is, until both parties have signed to an agreed terms, there's no contract. And if another offer comes in, just like when a buyer makes an offer, if they change their mind, they can withdraw it at any time prior to the seller accepting it. And it's the same for the seller and the buyer. So if the seller makes a counter offer and the buyer has not accepted it right then and there, or within a short period of time, if another offer comes in and it's more interesting to the seller, they can notify you that they're withdrawing their counter offer and accept the other one.
I agree.
So,
And then of course, there's the real estate attorney sort of practical component to the seminar, which you and I talked about. As a real estate attorney, when I'm given an offer and I'm asked either to await a purchase and sales agreement from the seller's attorney or as the seller's attorney to draft a purchase and sales agreement, I always have to remind myself to look down in that counteroffer language. That can cause an earthquake as the attorney, when you prepare a purchase and sales agreement that has a sales price significantly below what your client feels they accepted the contract. And of course, when they see the contract and it's wrong, they flip out. I get it. So I guess for any real estate attorneys that might be within, earshot of this webinar, when you're examining the offer, whether you're representing the buyer or the seller, make sure that you scroll down to the counteroffer language, because there is a lot of counteroffer activity, and I see it. And
yeah,
obviously, that will determine the price. It's usually price. I mean,
yeah. Well,
9 out of 10 times.
and I've had people say, well, isn't the counter offer good for like 24, 48 hours? It could be. It could be only good for an hour. If there ends up another offer, someone else submits an offer and it's cash, no home inspection, gap money, whatever, and it's much more favorable to the seller, they can just notify you and go on to the next offer. So something to keep in mind, if you do get a counter offer, think about it, make a decision. Don't wait 24, 48 hours to decide. If it's not what you want to accept, counter offer back and see if you can keep the negotiations going until you can come up with a happy terms for both of you. But be aware, if another offer comes in, they don't have to wait for you. Usually after an offer in Massachusetts, we do a purchase and sales agreement. Is it required to do purchase and sales? Do you find? Yeah, is it required?
I don't know. I don't know that I don't think that there's a law on the books that mandates it. And I know that the Supreme Judicial Court of Massachusetts has issued multiple legal rulings that a fully signed offer is a contract and enforceable. So we've had situations where buyer and seller signed the contract to purchase, also known as the offer, and then for whatever reason never made it to P&S. One of the aggrieved party runs off to court to try to enforce the offer. Seller responds by saying, well, that's not a contract, it's only an offer. The court's been very clear. If it's signed by both parties, it is an enforceable contract in the absence of a signed purchase and sales agreement. So we know that an offer is good enough. And we know that there isn't a state law that says that you shall draft a purchase and sales agreement, otherwise you can't buy the property. But it's certainly part of our custom in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts to transition from an offer which it just focuses on the most salient features of the contract: buyer, seller, price, closing date, financing, inspections, additional terms, to a full-blown purchase and sales agreement, which is much more elaborate and covers a lot more territory. So not legally required, but very much part of our practice in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts.
Absolutely. So Another thing that comes up is extensions. I mean, everything, none of these transactions, we pick a direction, we pick a closing date, we pick finance terms, when we're going to do our home inspection, when we're going to get our commitment for financing. But what if the buyer or the seller is requesting an extension? Does the buyer or the seller, the other party, do they have to give you an extension? So say I'm the buyer and I get in touch with the seller and I'm like, listen, I need 3 more days to get my financing in line. Can I have an extension for 3 days on commitment? And can we push the closing out 3 days? Is it required for the seller to do that? Sorry.
Not at all. So again, an area that's so rich, we could mine it over the course of days, weeks, months, years, because there's so much to say here. So first and foremost, in this part of the state, real estate transactions are considered to be date sensitive in that time will be of the essence. And that's a legal term that both lawyers and real estate agents are familiar with. And when you see that language in the contract, it means that closing date there, that date matters. That's the date. It's not the day after, it's not 2 days out, or it's not as soon as we can do it, or as close as we can get there as possible. It's that date. Time is of the essence. The closing is going to be on Wednesday, August, whatever. That's the date. And if you can't close on that date, you're in breach of the contract. Now, interestingly, I think you venture into Western Massachusetts periodically. I know I do. In parts of Western Massachusetts and Connecticut, which is sort of part and parcel of Western Mass, time is not of the essence in their real estate contracts. It's aspirational. So we're still trying to close on that date. But if I can't close on that date and I can only close on the day after that date, I'm not in breach of the contract. It's reasonably close to the contract date. So that's interesting. Sometimes attorneys from Springfield will wander into our real estate transactions and they'll be surprised by that. But for our purposes, certainly in Worcester County, Worcester North, Worcester County, Middlesex, everywhere in this general area, time is of the essence, which means the date is a hard and fast contract date, closing date, mostly commitment date too, another key date. So we are not entitled to extensions. I would say as a practical matter, parties are willing frequently to give an extension to protect a transaction, to keep a transaction alive. I've seen a few different nuances. I've seen sellers, when sellers become unnerved by the extension request, they may insist on an additional non-refundable deposit. Reasonable extensions, I think, are frequently entertained. Sometimes I see parties looking for concessions in exchange for their agreement. Let's talk about one other thing. The lopsided nature of a real estate transaction in terms of sellers' rights and remedies and buyers' rights and remedies. And I feel like I talk about this at least once a day. The seller, it's not fair. The seller definitely has more leverage because the seller can declare the contract in breach and the seller can withhold or seek to withhold the buyer's earnest money. What can the buyer do if you've got the seller that just says arbitrarily, I can't close on the closing date. My mover bailed on me. I need a 3-day extension. Buyers will call me all the time. What are my rights? They're limited. You could go to court, hire a lawyer and go to court and get an emergency ex parte hearing in front of a judge and explain it to the judge. And the judge is absolutely going to issue an order mandating that the seller show up at the registry of deeds and close on the appointed closing date. There's only one problem. It's going to cost you $20,000 in attorney's fees. So it's probably not worth it. And if the seller needs 2 days or 3 days, I think most buyers are just they're going to sort of grin and bear it and say, it stinks, but what choice do I have? So I think from a buyer's perspective, you probably go along with it. And it's the seller's market, which just makes this whole dynamic even worse.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
the seller can tell you to pound sand. So
Yeah.
basically things to kind of come away from this little discussion with. Time is of the essence in a real estate contract, which means these dates are very important and they should not be taken lightly or cavalierly. Number 2, enforcing a date can be tricky. Buyers don't have quite as much leverage as sellers. Finally, and we talked about this during our dry run, when we wind up in a true standoff about the closing and one party refusing to close either at all or on the appointed day, you will sometimes see the buyer march off to the registry of deeds with their realtor and their real estate attorney maybe paving the way for litigation, preserving their legal position, because they want to be able to tell the judge, Your Honor, we were ready, willing, and able to close on the appointed day. That is a box that you need to check if you have a seller that says, I'm not going to sell the property to you, and you know you're going to go to court and you want to win. You've got to make that trip to the Registry of Deeds to prove to the judge and the court that you really were prepared to close on that property. I had my certified check, my loan officer, my real estate agent, and the lawyer were all there, and we were ready, and the seller no-showed at the closing. And now, Your Honor, I want you to enforce the contract. So if you get that.
And that can go both ways. That can go both ways.
Yes,
You know,
it
your
can.
seller could go to the registry, I was ready, willing, and able, the buyer did not show.
Absolutely.
And, you know, we had a contract, and then they could fight for deposit money, or performance, you know, so.
Right, and by the way, I get asked that question a lot. What is that? What do you call the enforcement?
Performance.
We're getting into some esoteric areas here, but I still think it's instructional. What do you call that when we enforce a real estate contract against the objections of one of the parties, typically the seller? It's called specific performance. So what we do is we go to court and we say to the judge, I want you to make that seller specifically perform on that contract, make them sell the property to me. And they frequently will. And if the seller won't sign the deed, the judge will appoint somebody else to sign it for them. It's hardball. If it ever gets to that point.
You hope you never get there.
Hope you never get there. Don't get there. Don't be there.
So we picked out a few questions, and I don't want to keep you much longer because we did run a little over because we got a little mixed up here in the beginning. But we do have one more question, and it has to do with counter offers again. So if you make a counter offer, from the seller comes back with a counter offer, and the buyer verbally says, yeah, I'll accept it, is that binding? Again, it's verbal. It should be in writing, is my stance. You feel the same way, or what are your thoughts?
No, I agree with you, JoAnne. I think that if it is the purported verbal acceptance of a written counteroffer, and the counteroffer would be in writing, I think it's unenforceable. So I think that when you get that counter and it all comes through the loop, so you have the opportunity to do it real time on your phone. I mean, you don't have to wait until you get to the real estate office and sign an ink. If you get it on the phone, you get the counter on your phone, and you have a way of electronically signing that document to accept that counteroffer, it's done. And it's
it could even be just an email. Just an email, you know, seller's counter offering at $325. All of the terms are acceptable, and the agent goes back to the buyer. The buyer says, yes, we'll take it. I believe you could just email back and say, yes, let's get it written up. The buyer's willing to do that, and then get it written up as soon as possible.
I don't disagree. I think at that point, you've got an agreement in principle, and it's hard for parties to disavow that or walk away from it. But I still think that best case scenario, if it can be accomplished, is to get some kind of a signature on that document, electronic or otherwise, and just to eliminate any possibility of, well, then the seller says, yeah, but I never saw that email. So I had no idea that you accepted my counteroffer, and I accepted somebody else's offer, so I can't sell it to you. You know, once it's signed, then it's legally binding. So, but
so there you go. That's the biggest thing from the webinar. Get it in writing. Make sure everybody's always on the same page. You don't want to come back to he said, she said, or I thought this, or they said. No, get it in writing. If it can be said, if it can be read, it was said. If it can't be read, it was never said. So thank you again, Attorney Len Foy, for joining me today. I really appreciate your time. If anyone's out there looking to buy or sell or have real estate questions, please feel free to give us a call. Either one of us would be more than happy to spend a couple minutes and try to help you. I have a full team of agents, and Len has a wonderful team of wonderful staff that would be supportive and guide you through the process.
And JoAnne, let me ask this too, for the benefit of not just you and I, but also for those of you who are in attendance. Are we making a permanent record of this webinar so that we'll be able to distribute or disseminate this recording at some point for people that weren't able to see it? And by the way, are people in attendance able to see us, or is it just a
Yep.
Oh,
No,
I like-
everybody can see us. You and I can see each other. They really just can't talk because otherwise it gets a little confusing with everybody talking. So yes, and we are going to record it and it will be on YouTube, and we'll have it available if anyone wants a copy, and we'll actually promote it on Facebook and other social media sites.
Wonderful.
Thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful week and keep an eye out for our future webinars. Thank you.
Yes,
Len.
because we're going to do them again, right, JoAnne?
Absolutely. And we'll come up with some more questions. So if you have questions, send them to us. Have a great day. Thank you, guys. Bye now.
Thanks, guys.